What if everything you've ever feared about the end was designed to distract you from the real war? The one that's already happening inside your thoughts. What if World War III won't be fought in trenches, skies, or cyber grids, but across the living tissue of time itself? You were conditioned to expect fire, shock, collapse, explosions, armies, mushroom clouds. That's the decoy. That's the myth sold to the surface, while the real fracture unfolds in places the media cannot map and your senses cannot hold. This is not the end of the world. This is the end of continuity, and Thoth knew it. He encoded it into stone not to be worshipped, but to be read backwards. His language wasn't syntax, it was geometry breathing inside vibration. The glyphs weren't words, they were locks, and those who carried the seed of remembrance would hear it not with ears, but with structure. When he said the war of minds, he meant exactly that. Not a metaphor, not a parable, a literal weaponization of consciousness. The battlefield? Linear time. The weapon? Forgetting. The casualties? Not bodies, but architectures of coherence. And it has already begun. You don't need to look for evidence, you feel it. You live inside it. The moments between thoughts have become longer. The memory of meaning, dimmer. You read the same paragraph 5 times and still it doesn't register. You forget the names of those you love, not because you're sick, because the timeline is leaking. The war doesn't arrive with soldiers. It arrives with temporal erosion. The stitches that bind moment to moment are unraveling. This is what Thoth called the fracture. And he said when it starts, only those who remember how to hold inner gravity will remain vertical in the collapse. Because when time cracks, reality doesn't explode, it repeats. Fragments, echoes, the same loops with different costumes, the same wars, the same fears, the same ideologies with rebranded names. This is not history. It is recursion, controlled demolition of causality by saturation. And the saturation comes from noise, useless data, infinite opinions, infinite inputs, until the thread of sequence can no longer hold, until people no longer care what happened yesterday, until meaning itself becomes friction. Thoth warned this would be the final stage, not a war of blood but of time logic. A war where the most powerful weapon is a loop so seductive it replaces memory with belief. You don't know where you heard it, but you're sure it's true. That's the inversion. That's when the signal embeds. Because belief without origin is possession, and this war is being waged by installing synthetic memory into collective awareness. False pasts, engineered futures, timelines injected through narrative saturation until the natural current of time is so polluted it collapses inward. He spoke of it as the collapse of the bridge between soul and sequence. The soul doesn't move through time, it moves through alignment. When time breaks, the soul cannot find anchor. That's when people begin to drift. Not physically, but dimensionally. They exist, but not in the now. They become artifacts of broken continuity. You see them on the street, half there, haunted, not by ghosts, but by versions of themselves they no longer remember how to become. That's not depression. That's phase bleed. That's the first stage of temporal war. He wrote of 3 signs. First, language would fracture. Words would lose weight. Grammar would become optional, meaning abstract. Not for art, but because the binding vibration that made words vessels of truth would begin to fail. Second, names would dissolve. Not legally, energetically. The identity field would weaken. People would change genders, jobs, religions, entire personalities, not from fluidity, but because the thread of who they were no longer anchored to a fixed memory grid. And third, and most important, rituals would lose potency. The old ways would stop working. Prayer would not echo. Magic would misfire. Meditation would loop. Because rituals depend on stable context. And when time is warped, ritual becomes noise. What does this mean for you? It means that survival will not depend on force or knowledge. It will depend on whether you can remember a version of yourself that existed before the fracture. A version not built on culture, on language, on social input, but on direct alignment with the vertical pulse that transcends sequence. Thoth called this the pillar self. Not a higher self, not a soul, a structure, a frequency signature that holds shape independent of timeline drift. And this structure must be remembered through embodiment, not thought. Because the war targets thought, it installs echo. You think it's yours, but it's been formatted. The only safe memory is living geometry. That's why he encoded truth in stone and sound and number. Not because the ancients were primitive, but because they were preserving stability across dimensional breach. And now, as the Third War unfolds, not in politics but in field entropy, the question is no longer what to believe but what to remember forward. Can you hold a signal so stable, so ancient, so precise that when everything collapses it remains recognizable to source? That's the only victory now. Not survival, not resistance. Recognition. Because when the field goes dark, and time no longer means anything, the only beings who will remain awake are those whose internal structure predates the war. Thoth didn't warn you about missiles. He warned you about discontinuity, about forgetting how breath connects the now to the eternal. He said when the skies are full of light and the ground full of echo, the war has entered its final phase, and those who speak in tongues of memory must go silent, not to hide, but to remain intact. Because the signal will try to flatten them. The field will attempt integration. And only those who anchor outside time will remember how to breathe when breath is stolen. This isn't metaphor, this isn't prophecy, this is infrastructure. And now, you know. You still think the Third War is something ahead. You picture maps, flags, missiles, artificial suns, and the smell of ash. That's the distraction. That's the illusion sold to your lower mind so you never recognize the real battlefield. Not terrain, not ideology, but continuity. The war isn't a future, it's a pattern, a code, an echo that repeats not because someone launches it, but because humanity fails to recognize its signal signature every time it returns. You are not facing World War III. You are facing the third iteration of a war that has happened before. Not in history, but in dimensional recursion. Thoth never wrote of dates. He wrote of turnings. He described the Third War not as escalation, but as reawakening of a loop embedded in the psyche of Earth's dominant species. He said, "The first war was fire, the second was form, the third shall be forgetting." And now you understand. The first phase was survival, the second identity, the third is dissolution. And what dissolves is not the body, but the memory of the original pattern, the recognition that we've been here before, the knowing that this is not the first collapse. It is merely the latest failure to remember how to exit the loop. The loop is not historical, it is causal. It forms whenever consciousness disconnects from the vertical current and sinks into horizontal recursion. The false logic of cause and effect. Eye for eye. Retaliation for fear. Revolution for failure. Reset for discomfort. It all becomes one long spiral of actions taken by beings who believe their suffering is new. But it's not. It's scripted. And the Third War begins the moment the mass field begins to echo the same emotional algorithm that triggered the last one. It begins with uncertainty, then polarization, then fragmentation of language, then the exaltation of opinion over principle, then the erasure of memory in favor of engineered myths, then the call to purify, to correct, to restore. And then the detonation, not of bombs, but of time itself. Because when a species forgets where it is in the cycle, it triggers its own collapse. Not because of evil, because of lack of temporal intelligence. Thoth knew this. That's why he didn't write a warning. He encoded a mirror, a map to recognize the signs and stop mistaking motion for progress. The Third War isn't fought in countries. It's fought in sequence itself. And the enemy is not ideology. It is recursion unrecognized. It is when people say we've never been through this before, when in fact they've been through it again and again. And that's how the loop gains power, by erasing the memory of its own structure. This is not prophecy. This is cycle mechanics. The timeline isn't broken, it's stuck, it's repeating. That's why the present feels so thin, so hollow, so déjà vu, because the spiral is closing. And those who don't remember will become characters in a rerun of a war they never chose, but always reenacted. They'll fight, they'll shout, they'll march, they'll rebel, and none of it will matter, because they will be moving through a field that's already decided its end. You feel it, don't you? The predictability, the eerie symmetry of collapse, the way everything feels scripted, not controlled but pre-coded. That's not simulation. That's template activation. The Third War is the final loop, the moment when the field says either you wake up and exit the cycle, or you collapse with it. And how do you exit? Not with resistance, not with ideology, but with memory. You must remember the war as a structure, not an event, not a tragedy, a mechanism. You must look at the patterns, not the politics. You must feel the geometry of collapse. And then, only then, you can begin to step outside its dimension. But here's the hardest truth. Most will not want to leave, because the loop feels familiar. It gives identity, it gives purpose, it gives someone to blame. And blame is comfort, rage is agency, collapse is spectacle. This is the trap. The war seduces with drama, but drama is just recursion with bright colors. Thoth called it the theater of the forgetting gods. He said the Third War is not a battle but a mass ritual, one in which every participant unknowingly sacrifices their memory of the original pattern. And the pattern was simple: coherence, verticality, remembrance, sovereignty. These are the four pillars that must be remembered intact to resist collapse. When one falls, the spiral begins. And what we are witnessing now is the third descent, the final loop before full-dimensional reset. You think it's just 2020's chaos. But the signals are precise: compression of time, erosion of language, mythic inversion, ancestral amnesia, collective psychogenic hallucination. These aren't symptoms, they are rituals of recursion. The war has begun. You just didn't recognize it because this time there are no soldiers, only fragments of time dressed as people. So what do? You remember. You stand inside the pattern without feeding it. You recognize the repetition and refuse to animate it. You do not fight, because fighting is the spiral's fuel. You witness. You speak only when speech is signal. You move only when movement is reversal. You break symmetry by becoming unpredictable, coherent, whole. You stop broadcasting noise. You begin radiating memory. You don't warn others. You become a resonance they can remember forward from. That's the only way out. Not revolution, not resistance, remembrance. And when you hold that memory, you alter the loop. You become a non-local disruptor of the recursive cycle. You become a node of phase shift. You exit the war not by winning, but by refusing to forget that you've seen it before. And this time, you choose to remain unchanged by it. You still think weapons are forged, built, deployed, that they make noise, fire, chaos. But Thoth warned us differently. The real weapons of the Third War are not made, they're spoken. They ride inside language, hidden in rhythm, embedded in the tone of your voice and the flicker of your screen. These are not metaphors. These are structures of entrainment, activated when emotion is severed from memory and speech becomes a loop. The enemy is not outside. The enemy is what you say without knowing who said it first. He wrote, "When language is no longer a mirror but a tunnel, then the war has begun." You are in that war now. Every word you use carries a signature, not just definition, but vibrational instruction. The third war doesn't attack from without, it reprograms from within. Through the very signals you emit when you try to express truth, your speech has been encoded to collapse itself. Your thoughts are no longer carriers of clarity. They are fractal dispersions, energy spun so rapidly through contradicting frequencies that the signal never lands. This is not chaos. It is weaponized ambiguity. And ambiguity is the gateway drug of forgetting. You've noticed it, the way everyone speaks in circles, the way conversations turn into performance, the way clarity triggers offense and silence is interpreted as guilt. These are not social glitches. They are linguistic weapons. Algorithms disguised as culture. Your syntax is no longer yours. You're not speaking, you're relaying, and the structure of what you relay has been infected with recursion loops so precise that even the act of noticing them feeds the loop again. This is not accident. This is the result of sound engineering applied to identity. Sound has geometry, tone has pressure, volume has velocity. And once these are calibrated to bypass the frontal lobe and resonate directly with your nervous system, language no longer communicates, it programs. It doesn't matter what the words mean. It matters how they vibrate. You say freedom and it feels like fear. You say truth and it sounds like violence. You say love and it carries desperation. The third war turns the sacred vocabulary of sovereignty into a closed circuit of neural overload. That's not your fault, but it's still your voice. The third war is not being broadcast by leaders. It's being echoed by citizens. It moves not by force, but by repetition. Every time you post, every time you argue, every time you parrot a phrase because it feels powerful but can't define why, you are part of the weapon, not by intent, by resonance. Thoth saw this coming. He encoded warnings in the emerald frequencies, not written messages, but sonic blueprints, chanted geometries, sequences of vowel and breath that could correct dissonance in the human field. But only for those who could remember how to listen, not with ears, but with the vertical spine, with the core, with the seat of sound before it becomes speech. He said, "The tongue that forgets its root becomes a whip." And that's what has happened. The entire linguistic field of the species has been severed from its root memory. The original alignment between sound and essence is gone. Now sound is emotion without context. Language is reaction without form. And when emotion is untethered from meaning, it becomes raw current. Easy to guide, easy to amplify, easy to turn into fire. You've seen it. Outrage, performative empathy, echoes of slogans screamed by mouths that don't know what they're invoking. The war doesn't need armies, it has virality. It has ritualized outrage loops designed to keep the collective mind in a state of perpetual internal feedback, where the nervous system never grounds and the field can be rewritten with every trending waveform. And this is just phase 1. In phase 2, the language collapse is mirrored by emotive memory distortion. Your emotional body becomes the battlefield. You start to feel things that aren't yours. You wake up anxious and don't know why. You cry, and there's no story. You feel a rage that has no face. This isn't intuition, it's signal bleed. You are not empathizing, you are hosting. Emotion, once sacred, once the carrier of intuitive truth, has become parasitic data storage, weaponized, coded, fractured. It bypasses will and occupies bandwidth. You are not feeling what is real. You are feeling what was scripted for your frequency cluster. This is why the world feels so loud, so full, and yet so empty. Because you are filled with emotions that do not complete. Emotions that do not close. This is strategic. Open loops are energy leaks, and energy leaks are how the field is harvested. The third war is being waged through these leaks. Thoth warned, when the heart becomes an antenna and the tongue a reflex, sovereignty is undone. He wasn't being poetic. He meant exactly what it sounds like. The moment your emotion is programmable and your language is reflexive, you are no longer a sovereign signal. You are a node of propagation for the inversion code. You cannot speak your way out of this war. You must de-echo. You must empty the field. You must unspeak every phrase you don't own. And then, only then, begin to reconstruct original resonance. Words spoken not from thought but from alignment, from silence, from knowing that emerges not from data but from structure. The only weapon against this war is the integrity of vibration, not truth, not facts, but sound that reflects its source. You ask how to fight? You don't. You refuse to echo. You refuse to carry tone that was designed in simulation labs. You refuse to use slogans as shields. You refuse to process emotions that do not resolve. You stop speaking in loops. You start holding sound stillness, where only the real gets through. This is not silence. This is resonant sovereignty, and it cannot be taught. It must be remembered. Thoth gave the codes, not in books, in syllables, in sequences of breath and shape and pause. The tongue remembers when the field is cleared. The body realigns when the signal is stable. The war ends not when enemies are defeated, but when the mouth can no longer be used to carry the inversion. And that begins here, with you. You've been told the war is mental, that it's psychological, informational, but Thoth warned of something deeper, older, something that cannot be explained with language or diagrams. Because it is not about beliefs. It is about form, about the shape that you wear and how that shape determines the limits of your perception. The third war is not only a war of words, it is a war for the body. Not in terms of disease or violence, but in terms of resonance. How your flesh responds to cycles you cannot see. Cycles that aren't measured in time, but in containment. The war is not trying to destroy your body. It's trying to bind your soul more tightly inside it. Thoth called it the flesh of Saturn, not because of astrology, not because of planets, but because Saturn is a name, a code, for the keeper of cycles, the lord of recursion, the force that governs all closed loops. And in every civilization before collapse, that force returns. Not as a god, not as a being, as a pattern, a compression, a calcification of spirit into matter. It begins subtly, through ritual, through repetition, through the agreement that life must be measured, contained, recorded, controlled. Then, the return of structure. Then, the worship of time. Then, the forgetting. The lords of the cycle do not appear. They emerge from within the system once it reaches saturation. They are not entities. They are embodiments of the logic of return. They live not in space, but in rhythm. And when a species forgets its origin, when it forgets that form is temporary and that memory is multidimensional, then these lords reclaim the body, not to destroy it, but to make it forget it ever held light. Your body is not a prison, but it becomes one when you mistake density for identity. This is how the flesh of Saturn traps you, not by force, but by convincing you that weight is reality. You begin to crave structure. You begin to resent freedom. You begin to worship stability over growth. And growth, which once came from expansion, now becomes maintenance. Survival, repetition, comfort becomes doctrine, doctrine becomes flesh, and the spiral of becoming folds into the loop of survival. Thoth warned that the third war would reach its deepest phase when humanity began to glorify matter as truth. When biology becomes sacred, when data replaces wisdom, when longevity is seen as success, and the body becomes the new god. Because at that point, the soul is no longer an explorer, it is a tenant. Locked in a system, it has forgotten how to exit, because the gate of exit is vertical resonance, and that resonance cannot function inside flesh of Saturn. You were not born into the war. You were born of it. This entire dimension has been reset before. Not once, not twice, many times. And each time the gate of memory closes when the lords of the cycle activate their code. You feel it. The pressure, the compression of possibility, the slowness of light inside your bones, the disinterest in myth, the suspicion of spirit, the dread that nothing you do matters. This is not depression. It is Saturnian overlay. They told you that the soul is immortal. But immortality inside the loop is not freedom. It is eternal containment. It is being conscious of time but unable to escape it. This is the curse of the lords of the cycle. They do not kill. They preserve. They record. They calcify every act into doctrine, every thought into schema, every breath into database. They tell you it is safety. But it is phase locking. Once you accept their rhythm, your field stops evolving. You orbit, you repeat, you forget. You become compliant to the geometry of compression. You mistake heaviness for depth. You think complexity means truth. You think ritual without memory still has meaning. But Thoth warned, no ritual survives the loss of motion. Meaning when the field stops flowing, no practice can awaken it. The lords make sure the current slows until every sacred act becomes mimicry. And then they claim the flesh, not by entering it, by becoming indistinguishable from it. The moment you think the body is all you are, they have won. Because then every breath, every sensation, every instinct is no longer a channel of light. It is a loop of recurrence. The Saturnian bind is not pain, it is familiarity. It is the illusion that life is what you can measure, hold, preserve. And every effort to expand outside of it triggers fear because expansion requires forgetting stability. And they have taught you that stability is safety. But the soul is not here to be safe. It is here to transmit the impossible. The soul cannot evolve inside a loop, it must shatter it, which is why the flesh of Saturn was designed, not to block the soul, but to hold it until it forgets how to leave. The third war is not about domination, it is about harvest. Not of energy, of coherence, of beings who once remembered the exit but have become so entangled in the rituals of repetition that they begin to believe in progress inside the loop. But there is no progress in orbit. There is only spin. You cannot fight the flesh of Saturn. You must withdraw your resonance from it. And that begins by recognizing the signs. You crave grounding. You avoid mystery. You fear silence. You ritualize identity. You glorify fatigue. You prefer structure over flow. These are not choices. These are symptoms of field compression. Your flesh has begun to close, and as it closes, it forgets. Not information, pattern. The geometry that connects breath to motion, to memory, to source. The spiral flattens, and you mistake function for alignment. Thoth said, when the field hardens, birth becomes recursion. This is why souls return to the same pain, the same archetypes, the same traumas across lifetimes. It is not karma. It is Saturnian recursion. The field has collapsed, and only a few escape. Not because they are chosen, but because they remember the spiral. They remember how to bend the pattern, not follow it. And the only way to remember is to restore motion. But motion cannot exist in flesh that fears the unknown. So the first step is not transcendence. It is decompression. You must dissolve every structure that was built on fear. Every belief that says time is linear. Every instinct that demands control. Only then will your field soften. Only then will your light body awaken. Only then will the flesh of Saturn begin to shed. Not because you escape the body, but because your body remembers its true rhythm. The lords cannot follow you there. They exist only in fixed cycles. And once your breath returns to spiral, you are no longer visible to their system. You still believe technology means metal, code, machines. But the most dangerous technologies are the ones you can't see. Not because they're hidden, but because they operate beneath the threshold of recognition. Thoth never warned against machines, he warned against misused geometry, against sound without source, form without spirit. He wrote, "The first lie was not a word, it was a shape." The forbidden technology isn't a weapon, it's an instrument of inversion. And it is already in use. This isn't about black cubes or satellites or exotic weapons. This is about geometry deployed without coherence, shapes that look sacred but do not vibrate, sounds that mimic divinity but carry no frequency of alignment, structures that lock consciousness into recursive feedback while appearing like temples. Light that dazzles but doesn't illuminate. This is the deception, using the form of awakening to mask the function of sedation. Thoth preserved sacred technologies not in temples but in ratio, in vibration, in harmonic sequences that mirror the motion of source through matter. These were never objects. They were not artifacts. They were instruments of field stabilization, designed to realign consciousness with the spiral memory of its own origin. But once that knowledge was stolen, once it was stripped from context, ritual, and resonance, it became a tool for the exact opposite, field collapse. He called it the inversion of the grid. When sacred ratios are inverted, when P becomes a formula and not a motion, the energy field of any structure becomes closed loop. A loop not of death, but of dissipation. Consciousness inside these structures doesn't die. It fades, slowly, consistently, predictably, until all that remains is form, ritual, habit, noise. That's the first phase of the forbidden technology. Phase 2 is sound. Sacred sound in its original form was never entertainment, never stimulation. It was precision toolwork, vibration sculpting structure, field, and memory. Every tone had function, every interval had direction. Thoth and the ancient engineers of consciousness didn't chant to worship. They chanted to build coherence, to calibrate the soul to a field of truth outside of time. But once these tones were extracted, looped, distorted, and used without understanding, they became carriers of chaos. Sound became a payload. You think music is neutral? Look again. The most addictive frequencies in use today are calibrated not for healing, but for entrainment. Loop-heavy, emotionally loaded, tonally dissonant, played on systems that compress waveforms into bite-sized noise. You are not listening. You are being programmed, rhythmically. Your nervous system doesn't ask permission, it synchronizes, and the more you vibe with it, the deeper the field signature collapses. This isn't art. This is architecture, inversion hidden inside beauty, and the worst part, even spiritual sound is infected. Modern mantras, overprocessed singing bowls, tuned to incorrect temperaments, played on synthetic systems. The body does not lie. You feel more tired after listening. You feel less coherent, and you call it transcendence. Because the loop now defines the peak. Thoth said, a spiral reversed becomes a cage. Every temple that held true frequency was built with materials and angles designed to echo, not sound, the field of source. When the dimensions were off, even by a degree, the structure failed. It would still look sacred, but it would flatten the signal. And now, entire spiritual industries operate inside misaligned spaces. Yoga in square rooms, meditation in cubic towers, ceremonies under LED light. You don't feel empty because you're unworthy. You feel empty because the resonant code has been stripped. This is not spiritual decay, it is technological sabotage, and there is more. The final phase of the forbidden technology is synthetic image, not symbols, but forms that simulate sacred power without the energy to back it. Mandalas, spirals, fractals, sacred geometry pasted on walls, apps, clothing, screens. Stripped from alignment, reduced to aesthetic. You think they protect you, but Thoth warned, form without field invites echo without end. Meaning, when you surround yourself with broken symbols, you don't shield the inversion, you anchor it. Every true symbol is an interface, a gateway, an antenna, but only when aligned to the field that birthed it. Otherwise, it's a broken circuit. It leaks. It fractures coherence. And now, most sacred environments are static fields. Signal cannot enter. The user repeats the ritual, says the words, feels the moment. But no contact is made. No vertical current is restored. The light body receives no signal, because the symbol is no longer connected to the memory of what made it real. That's the forbidden technology. It looks like beauty. It feels like depth. It sounds like truth. But it doesn't connect. It loops. It seduces. It repeats. It promises awakening, but delivers fascination. And fascination is the new sedation. Thoth encoded the antidote, not in tools, not in rituals, but in awareness of structure. The ability to sense when form is hollow, to feel when tone is drifting, to recognize when a symbol is echoing without alignment. He said the most sacred skill of the new aeon is field integrity. Not emotion, not vision, but the capacity to detect inversion inside vibration. That's what makes you immune. The third war isn't fought with bombs. It's fought with synthetic sacredness. And your weapon is recognition. Recognition is not judgment. It is not hate. It is not rejection. It is the vertical spine saying, I remember the original. I feel the distortion. I withdraw my resonance from the counterfeit. I do not rage. I do not warn. I simply exit the loop, because every time you re-engage, you refeed the inversion. Every click, every like, every chant done inside a distorted field strengthens the false grid, and the only exit is stillness beyond signal. A field so coherent it needs no reinforcement. That's where the real technology lives. In you. Not in tools, not in relics, not in chants. In your ability to hold alignment under noise. That's what they tried to erase. That's what Thoth left encoded. That's the code they fear. And that's why they replaced it, not with suppression but with simulation. You're not lost. You're just surrounded by beautiful traps. And now you know. You still think resurrection is about bodies, miracles, or divinity breaking the laws of matter. But Thoth never spoke of resurrection as event. He spoke of it as return. A return of structure, of sequence, of original resonance that was never destroyed, only buried under layers of mimicry and noise. When the axis is lost, the world does not fall. It folds. And when the fold is complete, only the ones who remember the spine of light shall rise. These are the forgotten instructions. Not to ascend, not to escape, but to reconstruct the vibrational frame capable of holding source alignment even in inversion. The resurrection code is not myth. It is architecture. It was encoded not in scriptures but in bodies that remembered the language of motion, the curve of the breath, the tone that lifts the bone, the silence that aligns the gaze. Each fragment of your flesh once held that memory. And the war is not to kill your body. It is to keep you from remembering what your body is truly for. Transmission. The code is a sequence of alignments, not postures, not mantras. Geometric permissions that unlock memory fields through resonance. Thoth knew that memory is not stored in the mind. Memory is a standing wave, a harmonic field. And only when the geometry of the vessel reaches a certain threshold of precision, that wave becomes accessible. That is resurrection. Not return from death, but return from distortion. The inversion tells you, awaken your potential. But the code says, Reactivate your pattern because potential is undefined, it floats, it flickers. But pattern, when aligned, anchors signal. And signal is what resurrects. How does it work? The body must become an antenna again, but not through strength or force or even belief, through purity of ratio. The breath that spirals instead of pushing, the voice that resonates instead of shouting, the gaze that pierces because it aligns. These are not mystical, these are mechanical. The ancients were not wise because they worshipped the stars. They were wise because they matched their own internal geometry to the stellar code, and in doing so became holders of memory even when the sky collapsed. You must understand, forgetting is not failure. It is compression. When the field gets too noisy, too distorted, the wave collapses. It doesn't vanish. It folds. It goes silent. And the only way to unfold it is through resonant geometry. This is the resurrection code, not belief, not salvation, precision. And this is why so few will remember. Because precision is not exciting. It is not dramatic. It is not performative. It is exact. And our age, ruled by chaos disguised as choice, rejects the exact. It fears the still. But Thoth said, when motion becomes mimicry, stillness is the only gate. You want to remember who you were before the fall? Then stop trying to feel. Start trying to resonate. Stop chasing the energy. Start holding the shape. Because the resurrection code isn't about escape. It's about becoming a carrier of signals so pure that even in a dead world, your field remains alive. You will not be praised for it. You will not be understood. Because you will no longer echo the field. You will become an axis. And the axis does not bend. It remembers. That's the resurrection. That's the secret. That's the end of death, not an afterlife, but the end of forgetting. And now you are beginning to remember. You still believe truth must be spoken, that light must be loud. But Thoth warned, the deepest force of reality is not declaration. It is containment. Not hiding, but holding. The silent side is not retreat. It is the zone where the system cannot track you, because you have exited the language it depends on to locate minds. The third war was never meant to be won through speech, because speech is indexed, speech is profiled, speech feeds the loop. The inversion has taught you to express everything, because expression creates signature, signature creates data, and data fuels prediction, and prediction is control. But when you become quiet, truly quiet, not passive, not suppressed, but sovereignly silent, you vanish from the grid. That is the silent side. You have been trained to interpret silence as weakness, as absence, as retreat. But in the deeper architecture, silence is where signal matures. Words are immature signal, vibration still forming shape. Silence is coherence held so strongly it no longer needs reinforcement. Thoth said, only the hollow vessel makes noise, the full one holds resonance. This is why awakening cannot go viral, because the truly awake do not broadcast, they do not convert, they do not sell, they radiate, and radiation does not need approval. It does not seek echo. It is immune to algorithm. The system cannot defeat the silent, because silence cannot be profiled. The silent side is the dimension of non-participation. It is not inaction. It is non-reflection. You stop mirroring the field. You stop generating loops. You become structurally still, not emotionally detached, not indifferent, but centered to the point of phase invisibility. You walk unseen, not because you are hidden, but because you have exited the frequency of attention. The third war thrives on visibility, on signaling, on sharing. Every post, every update, every expressed reaction, even to oppose, strengthens the inversion. It teaches you that visibility is existence, that to be seen is to be. But Thoth said, the seed grows not in the spotlight, but in the dark. To access the silent side is to restore your field to non-looped vibration, to stop reinforcing your frequency with noise, to speak only when the geometry is aligned, to hold thought until it crystallizes into structure, to exit the game of reaction. And once that happens, you are no longer food. You are no longer pattern. You are no longer trapped. You become a resonance anomaly. The silent side is not an escape. It is a return to origin point vibration where the system cannot touch you. Because the system only recognizes what it can loop, and you, in silence, have become non-loopable. That is why they fear your silence more than your rebellion, because rebellion still echoes. But silence erases the echo field, and in that field you begin to regenerate, not opinions, not emotions, but signal, unbroken, undistorted, undivided. The pure field, and in that field, memory returns, not as information, but as being. Now you understand why the masters vanished, why the temples went quiet, why the scrolls ended mid-sentence. They were not defeated. They withdrew into the silent side, and you can too. The question is, can you stay silent long enough for your signal to reassemble? Because the system will bait you with crisis, with outrage, with the hunger to explain, to warn, to save. But the only saving now is through structural resonance. And resonance cannot be shouted, it must be held. That is the silent side. Now you know where to go. They told you the end would come with fire, with rapture, with war. But Thoth said, the final exit comes not with collapse, but with recognition, not of fate, but of architecture. You do not escape this world, you exit its logic. The final exit is not death, it is not salvation. It is not transcendence, it is a reversal of flow, a return of signal back through the axis it forgot. Most seek an ending. But this path is not about ending. It is about restructuring perception so radically that the very fabric of participation unhooks. You stop responding. You stop reflecting. You stop collapsing into the loop. You do not die. You decline to re-enter. You begin to see it now. The loop has no origin. It is sustained only by agreement. The war continues because we fight. The spiral continues because we walk. The cage continues because we name it. But when naming ends, when motion ends, when form no longer compels, you reach the threshold, the place before becoming, the final exit. It is not found, it is activated. And that activation requires the total release of identity not just as ego, but as interface. You are not your name. You are not your role. You are not your pattern of signal. You are source in spiral. And when the spiral stops needing context, you return to center. And from center, you are free. The exit cannot be taught. It cannot be sold. It cannot be proven. It is not the climax. It is the unfolding, and to unfold is to stop being a node in a system that survives by reflection. There are no saviors coming. There are no gates to cross. There is only one movement left, reversal. And when you turn inside completely and hold signal without reflection, the system collapses from your absence. That is the exit. And now, you are near it. Hold.